I'm excited to be with you this morning and study God's Word. This fall, we've been going through the book of Luke, and yet we haven't been just covering it verse in chapter. We've been sort of covering the book of Luke topically, and we've been asking this question: what does it look like to be a disciple of Jesus, to be a follower of His? And we've sort of chased that question around several different topics. We've sort of picked a different one each week. And so we've covered topics like, what does it mean to be a follower of Jesus when life gets really confusing? Where do we get this strength to follow Jesus? I mean, those are some pretty big shoes to fill. How do we have the ability to follow Him? Last week we talked about how Jesus doesn't really want followers who have pretense. He doesn't need us to be perfect. He's sort of made provision for that in His death and resurrection. What He does want is followers who are going to be real and who are going to be transparent. Well, this week we come to a topic that Jesus actually talks about quite a lot, especially in the book of Luke. It's a theme that comes up over and over again, and yet we haven't hit on it yet, and that is the topic of our material possessions, of money. How do followers of Jesus relate to and handle their material possessions? That's the topic of our conversation today. And Jesus talks about this a lot. He teaches on it. He gives rebukes on it. He gives commands. He gives encouragements. And if it was needed for the people that Jesus spoke to in that day, it is needed for us today way more, for a couple different reasons. One, we are wealthier. I mean, we live in the wealthiest country that the world has ever known. Think of the people that Jesus was speaking to, most of whom were very poor and very humble people. They worked sort of day labor kind of jobs, worked day by day for that day's wage. And when we see the kinds of things Jesus says to them in their circumstances, how much more would He say those things to us in ours? Because we are wealthier. But the second reason why we need what Jesus has to say about our material possessions, even more than they did back then, is our culture is so much more individualistic. Jesus was speaking to people who lived in a very communal society. The way life worked was way more interconnected, interdependent upon one another, and yet into that context, Jesus still sort of raises the stakes on what it means to care for one another. So how much more in our post-industrial revolution, individualistic culture would Jesus say some of the same things to us? So both because we're wealthier and because we're in a culture that's more individualistic, we are in desperate need of what Jesus has to teach us this morning. And we're going to be in a passage that's basically, here's how I want to frame the question. How do you define the good life? How do you go after the good life? For followers of Jesus, what is the good life, especially as it relates to money, to wealth, to material possessions? Because in our passage this morning, Jesus is basically going to lay out that there's two approaches to going after the good life. But before we get into our passage, I want to just share a story. In Randy Alcorn's little book, The Treasure Principle, I love little books. I mean, who has time for big, thick books? I mean, make your whole case in 120 half pages, please. But he tells a story about a time when he took a trip to Cairo, Egypt. And while he was in Cairo, he visited two burial sites. One, he visited the burial site of King Tut, and he also visited the burial site of William Borden. Now, William Borden was a Yale graduate, and he was the heir of a family fortune. And yet, God had so touched his heart and sort of moved him in the area of missions and wanting to reach the Muslim world with the gospel, that William Borden left all of that wealth. He could have had a life of comfort, of ease. He could have spent all of that wealth on his own needs, but he decided not to. Instead, he spent hundreds of thousands of dollars in support of missions, and then eventually he himself moved over to Egypt to share the gospel with Muslim people. Well, tragically, about 5 months after he got to Egypt, he contracted spinal meningitis and he passed away. Now, only a few miles from his burial site, in the National Museum in Egypt, is King Tut's burial, where his his golden casket is inside a golden tomb, which is inside a golden tomb, which is inside a golden tomb. And there are literally thousands of golden artifacts all surrounding his casket. Because for ancient Egyptians, they thought that all of your material possessions went with you into the afterlife. And yet there, all of King Tut's treasure, it sat collecting sand and collecting dust until about 3,000 years later when it was finally discovered. Now you compare and contrast these two burial sites. If you wanted to go to William Borden's burial site, you'd have to sneak off to this back alley and you'd find this dusted gravestone, and on it describes this life in pursuit of Christ and this desire to share the gospel with Muslim people. And there's a line at the bottom of it that says, "This life makes no sense apart from Christ." That there is no explanation for this life outside of Jesus Christ. And you look at these two burial sites, one right next to the other, and King Tut's life, it's tragic. Because while he amassed all of this treasure stayed where it was. And he left it behind. And William Borden, on the other hand, he forsook all his treasure in pursuit of the treasures of Christ. And the thing he treasured most, Jesus Christ, was waiting for him when he died. How do you define the good life? In the passage we're going to look at this morning, in Luke chapter 12, Jesus lays out these two approaches to how you go after the good life. And in this passage, Jesus is all over the place. I mean, he tells a parable, he gives some commands, he's going to give illustrations from nature. He has lots of different styles in his teaching. But one of the things that was really fascinating to me is, as I've been reading and rereading and studying, all of what he says sort of filters down into these two approaches. So before we go any further, I want us just to hear this entire passage, and then we'll kind of go back through and pull out these two approaches. But since you hear me talk a lot, I'm going to ask Samara to come and read our passage for us. Thank you.
Good morning. Good morning. We are in Luke chapter 12, verses 13 through 34. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Jesus replied, "Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you?" Then he said to them, "Watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. A man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions." And he told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man produced a good crop. He thought to himself, "What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "This is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of good things laid up for many years. Take life easy. Eat, drink, and be merry." But God said to him, "You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be when anyone who stores up things for himself, but is not rich toward God." Then Jesus said to his disciples, "Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat, or about your body, what you will wear. Life is more than food, and the body more than clothes. Consider the ravens. They do not sow or reap. They have no storeroom or barn, yet God feeds them. And how much more valuable you are than birds. Who of you by worrying can add a single hour to his life? Since you cannot do this very little thing, why do you worry about the rest? Consider how the lilies grow. They do not labor or spin, yet I tell you, not even Solomon in all his splendor was dressed like one of these. If that is how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and tomorrow is thrown into the fire, how much more will he clothe you, O you of little faith? And do not set your heart on what you will eat or drink. Do not worry about it, for the pagan world runs after such things, and your Father knows you need them. But seek his kingdom, and these things will be given to you as well. Do not be afraid, little flock, for your Father has been pleased to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give to the poor. Provide purses for yourself that will not wear out, a treasure no thief comes near and no moth destroys. A treasure in heaven that will not be exhausted, where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also.
Thanks. All right, so let's talk about these two approaches. The first approach is mainly in the first passage and first half, and then the others is in the second, but Jesus jumps around a little bit. I want us to pull some of the key characteristics of each of these approaches. And actually, by the end of the time, I kind of want to fill out this chart here. So if you're a note taker, if you want to write on your bulletin, you just want to sort of capture some of this, some of these different characteristics that get pulled out about these two approaches. But Jesus doesn't just all of a sudden start talking about this. He's responding to a question. Jesus is with this crowd of people, and a man stands up and asks Jesus to sort of be the go-between. Here's what the man says. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Presumably this is probably the younger brother. In that culture, the older brother was left almost everything. An inheritance was almost always land. And so this younger brother is wanting Jesus to sort of apply a little bit of pressure so that the older brother would divide the inheritance. But Jesus says, "I'm not a communist. I'm not going to redistribute resources here." Jesus says, "Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbitrator between you?" Instead, Jesus says, "Okay, I'm not going to do that, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about something that's a little deeper, that's going to affect both of you brothers. In fact, it's going to affect the whole crowd standing here." He says, verse 15, "Then he said to them, 'Watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in the abundance of possessions.'" This abundance of possessions, there's a universal pull, sort of like gravity, towards greed, both in the ancient world and in ours today. And so the first approach to how you go after the good life is, Jesus would say, in the abundance of possessions. That's how you find the true and the best life. The one with the most toys wins. Now, I'm sure we can identify with this, because this is the water we swim in. This is our culture. Every commercial we see, every advertisement, every billboard, every TV show or movie, everything says if you just have this one thing, then your life will be good. You'll be happy. Things will be better. And in some ways, it's kind of true. Like, there is a little bit of a high, a little bit of a buzz that comes from buying something. Whether it's new clothes, whether it's new shoes, whether it's a new car. I was trying to remember the last time I had that sort of high or buzz from buying something. And, I'm sort of a gadgety kind of person. A couple of years ago for Christmas, my parents gave us an Alexa. Anyone have an Alexa in here? Well, I kind of got into the Alexa. And, she can make to-do lists, and she keeps our shopping lists. You listen to music. So before long, I bought one for the office here. And then we had to have one in Jen's classroom, and then had to have one in the bathroom, because, you're brushing your teeth, and you're like, oh yeah, I need to put that on the shopping list. So, and then just last week, they came out with Alexa Auto. And so I have one in my car now. So there's a little bit of we can kind of maybe Alexa doesn't do it for you. I'm sure those of you who are conspiracy theorists are having a heyday right now. Listen, my life's not that interesting. Nobody's listening to my life. But there is some sense that there's some life that can be found in possessions. Whether it's upgrading a house or a wardrobe or taking fancy vacations. It's easy, very easy to place all of our hopes, dreams, and passions in possessions and in the lifestyle that can come from having certain things. That is very easy to do. The problem with this approach is that we are looking for life in the created rather than in the Creator. And that is what Scripture calls, again and again, idolatry. Romans 1 repeatedly describes idolatry as when you exchange the Creator, the glory of the Creator, for the created. And that's what happens in this approach. Notice that the core drive in this approach, when you're finding life in the abundance of your possessions, Jesus says, the core drive, watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Core drive is greed. And depending on what version you have, it might say covetousness. It's this constantly wanting what others have. It's wanting as much as someone else has. It's wanting more than they have. And that makes sense that that's our core drive, because if life is found in stuff, then the main quest in life is going to be to get more stuff. Now notice Jesus says, watch out, be on your guard. Those are military type words, defensive words. I think what he's saying is, if we don't defend against this, this will be naturally how we go. Because, and I don't know if that's because of the pervasiveness of this approach to life, everyone else is living this way, and so we're going to get swept along with it, or if Jesus is saying because of our own sinful nature and our bent away from God, that we're going to try to find life in things instead of in Him. I don't know why he's saying it's so pervasive, but he's saying if you don't guard against it, this will be the way that you'll try to find life. And then Jesus gets into a parable. He's going to give an example of somebody who's living life this way. And there's several interesting characteristics that we'll see that come out of this parable. Look at verse 16. He told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. This parable starts innocently enough. The man in this story, he happens to have a very fruitful harvest. And now he has to decide, what am I going to do with all of the overflow? There's nothing wrong yet. He didn't get this abundant wealth through any immoral means. There's nothing wrong so far. And as we're going to see, he's going to build bigger barns so that he can store his crops. There's not even anything wrong with that at this point. His error comes in how he views what becomes his. In these next few verses, I highlight them for you. Look how many times he says the words I and my, as if he owns it all. He thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. Then he said, this is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. You see how he relates to his stuff? He views himself as the owner. And because he's the owner of all of it, he can decide to do whatever he wants to with it. But how did he get his abundance? All he did is plant his fields the same way he's done every year. No, God's the one who made the harvest abundant that year. And yet there's neither gratitude in this man's heart, nor is there any concern that maybe I should find out, since God's the one who gave it to me, how God thinks I should use these abundant resources. And just like this guy, when we work for our money, we often feel like it's ours. We earned it. This owner mentality, it's so easy to have. In fact, it's the default mentality unless we sort of guard against it. But who gave us our minds to be able to work, to be able to go to school? Who gave us the strength? Who woke us up this morning and gives us the ability to do the work God's called us to do? Truth is, it's God. And so the next question should be, okay, well, God, what do you want me to do with what you've given me? And yet, this guy feels no responsibility at all to God. The directed use of his abundance is in exclusive self-interest, as you can see from all those highlights up there. He will not share his abundance. No, instead, he's going to keep it for his own private use. His goal is total leisure and self-indulgence. There's absolutely zero concern for the needs of anyone else around him. This parable, it concludes with God speaking up. Although this man has lived with sort of no reference to God at all, God still is in charge. And so God speaks in verse 20. But God said to him, you fool. And again, as we said last week, fool doesn't mean a stupid person. A fool is someone who lives with no reference to God, which is what this person's been doing. You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? And then Jesus tags on this sort of concluding line to this parable. This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich towards God. Jesus is saying, if you revolve your life around the abundance of your possessions, if that is what you treasure most, when it's finally all done and over, you will be separated from what you treasure most. It will be left behind. You can't take it with you. Now, there's one more characteristic of this first approach to life that I want to draw our attention to, but it actually comes in the next passage. And in this next sort of couple paragraphs, yours may even have a heading on it. The key theme that Jesus brings out over and over and over again is do not worry. Do not be anxious. Or something to that effect. 5 different times. Over and over again, he's telling his disciples not to worry. Because that's how he observes everyone around him living. And he says, no, not so with you. So this approach to finding life in the abundance of possessions is filled with worry. It's filled with anxiety. Jesus says this in verse 29 and 30. He says, do not set your heart on what you will eat or drink. Do not worry about it, for the pagan world runs after such things. Worry, anxiety, fear, that's what characterizes this approach to life. And it kind of makes sense, because one of our deepest needs as human beings is our need for security. And when our life is built on our possessions are inherently insecure. Thieves can steal them. A fire can consume them. They can decay. The stock market can turn and they can all vanish in a matter of days. So if our life is built around our stuff and our stuff is inherently insecure, then life is going to be filled with worry and anxiety. Those are the hallmark traits of this approach to life. So you can go to the next slide. So this is what this first approach looks like. It's not a very pretty picture. And you can see if I had to pick one word to sort of sum up this approach to life, it's the word self. Self's the one who gets credit for all of the abundance. All of the abundance is used on the self. The goal of life is how the self can get more. It's not a pretty picture. And I think that's Jesus' point. I think he said he's trying to help us sort of zoom out a little bit and see what does a life that's lived around possessions really look like? And it's not pretty. I think his hope is that we might look at that and say, you know what? Well, maybe there's another way to live. Maybe, just maybe, we'll embrace another approach, which is what he's about to lay out for us. So let me give us the title of the next one, and then we'll sort of go through and see how Jesus makes his argument for it. The other approach is caring for others out of the Lord's provision. I find it interesting. Jesus, he almost completely opposite goes about each of these characteristics as he did on the first half. He starts with our need for security, that deep human need that we all have, this need to feel secure. And in this second passage here, he's talking about food and clothing, the most basic things in life. He's no longer talking about barns filled with excess. Now he's talking about these very basic needs that we have. Food, clothing, things where if we go a few days without them, things get really scary really quickly. And for most people, such core needs, when those core needs aren't met, the first response is going to be worry. It's going to be anxiety. And then when we finally get stuff, it's going to be hoarding. And it's going to be, the focus turns completely inward. That's the approach number one. Jesus is going to call for a different approach. He's going to call for an approach that trusts God, our Father, to provide for us. So let's look at this. Verse 22. Then Jesus said to his disciples, "Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat, or about your body, what you will wear. For the body is more than food. For life is more than food, and the body more than clothes." So here he's telling us not to worry, but he hasn't yet told us why we shouldn't worry. That's what he's about to do. He's going to give 3 illustrations from nature. I'm guessing Jesus is preaching, and he's looking around him, and he sees all these different object lessons right around him. The first one he says is, consider the ravens. Verse 24, he says, consider the ravens. They do not sow or reap. They have no storeroom or barn, yet God feeds them. Couple things to note about ravens. They were the least respected bird in the ancient world. Probably because like today, they're everywhere. You know how you go to Walmart parking lot and there's like 1,000 birds right there? Maybe that was the same thing in Jesus' day. They were just nasty birds that were everywhere. According to Leviticus 11, they're an unclean animal. So if you were to put all of the animals in order, ravens fall pretty far down to the bottom. And yet Jesus says, God cares for them. The point of this is the comprehensive nature of the care of God. Because God will surely care for them, ravens don't need to be anxious. You have never seen an anxious bird. You've probably seen an angry bird, but you've never seen an anxious bird. They're never worried, is the supply of worms going to run out? And yet they don't just wait for the worms to sort of crawl down their beak either. They cooperate with God in His provision. But there's no anxiety in that equation. God's comprehensive care extends all the way down to the ravens. And then Jesus throws in sort of the kicker phrase, which on one hand is obvious, and yet this is probably where all of us get off. He says, and how much more valuable you are than the birds. And of course, up here, I think we all get that immediately. Yes, humans, we're made in the image of God, so birds, okay, and then humans, we're more up here. So yeah, God cares for us more. We get that sort of mentally. And yet, how often do we feel like God is indifferent to our situation? God, he's way up there, and here I am, way down here. God doesn't really know or care what's going on in my little old life. I'm just like one of the birds flying around. And yet, Jesus says, no. God sees your situation, and He cares for you. He's going to provide for you. Jesus is going after our hearts. Our minds might get that God cares for us, but Jesus is trying to convince our hearts that God cares for us. Then He's going to give a second illustration. He says, consider the wildflowers, how they grow. They do not labor or spin. Yet I tell you, not even Solomon in all his splendor was dressed like one of these. The point of this illustration is that wildflowers don't do anything. They don't work to take care of themselves. They can't labor. They can't spin. All they do is sit there. And yet God clothes them in unmatched beauty. If God cares that much for flowers, He'll certainly care for you and me. Again, He's going after our hearts. He says, believe it. Believe in God's care for you. And then the third one. He says, if that is how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and tomorrow is thrown into the fire, how much more will God clothe you, you of little faith? Now, almost every time grass comes up in Scripture, it's brought up to talk about its transitoriness, to talk about how temporary grass is. And that's still true today. Most weekends, I mow the lawn on Tuesday. That grass is in a bag about to be hauled away. That's how temporary grass is. Here today, gone tomorrow. And yet, if God clothes something that's that temporary, how much more will God clothe you and me, human beings made in His image, who are eternal beings? Jesus is pleading with our hearts. He's saying to each one of us, you matter to God. You matter so much. Do you know it deeply? You matter more than the ravens. You matter more than the flowers. You matter more than the grass. And yet, look, God is taking care of them. He will take care of you. So deep, in the deepest part of your being, trust His attentive care. And if he hasn't made his point yet, he adds one more allusion at the end that's really the kicker for all of this. 29 and 30. He says, do not set your heart on what you will eat or drink. Do not worry about it, for the pagan world runs after all such things, but your Father knows that you need them. Jesus says, we're not talking about a creator with his creatures. We're talking about a father with his children. What father is not going to take care of his children? I've got a 3-year-old at home. I don't think he's ever been anxious about food or clothing in his whole life. But why? It's because he has parents he can trust. If he's ever hungry or if he's ever cold, he just asks. And I think that's what Jesus is saying here. Worry, anxiety, they don't have any place in a child's life because they can trust their parent. The trust in God's fatherly provision is to be the foundation of how we look at our resources, how we look at our material possessions. Our identity isn't tied to any created thing. Our identity is based in our connection with the Creator. So it's not this idolatrous relationship. No, it's not. Our value, our meaning doesn't come from what we have. It comes from who we're connected to. And then notice how we look at our possessions then. I think verse 31 sort of sheds some light to this. But seek His kingdom, and these things will be given to you as well. Over and over, 5 times in this passage, do not worry, do not worry, do not worry. With the opposite being trust. But if that's what we're not supposed to do, not to worry, what are we supposed to do? Jesus says, seek His kingdom. We're to view ourselves and everything in our lives as agents for His kingdom, as servants in His house. I think the word I put up there is stewards. We're to steward everything He's given us. So think of that example parable that Jesus told earlier. This guy who all of a sudden gets this abundance just dropped in his lap. Well, he should have responded. A steward responds in gratitude because he didn't do anything to get it. And then a steward says, okay, now you've given it to me. How do you want me to use it for your kingdom? I'm a steward. And this security that we have in God, that we're going to trust He's going to take care of us, that is what actually frees us to be generous towards others. If we don't think we're going to make it, if we don't think we're going to be taken care of, we're going to hold on real tight. No, it's only as we trust that He values and loves us that we can open up our grip and be generous. Verse 33, sell your possessions and give to the poor. The direction is no longer toward self, but it's toward those around us. Greed becomes replaced by generosity as the core drive in a believer's life. And the result is completely opposite. Jesus ends this passage with the result. Provide purses for yourself that will not wear out, a treasure in heaven that will never fail, where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Because this is where life is found. Life is found in connection to our relationship with the Father. If He is the thing we treasure most, the one we treasure most, then when we die, all of our treasure is still there. We actually meet our treasure face to face. So if self is the single word on approach number 1, I'd probably put the word trust as the single word on approach number 2. Because trust is what brings our deep sense of security. Trust is what opens our hand to be generous towards others. I love this passage because it really gives some self-reflective parameters for each of us. What's the anxiety level like in your life? What's the worry barometer in your life? And then he also gives us our generosity. How generous are we? How open-handed or closed-handed are we? And I think Jesus says both of those are going to tell you some sense of where you find your security. Do you find your security in your loving Father who cares for you, or do you find your security in your stuff? And so my prayer has been that we would grasp how high and wide and deep is the love of God for us, and that would free us to be generous stewards of what He gives us. Let me pray for us.